George Patton once made a promise that seemed utterly impossible to keep. On December 19, 1944, in a freezing barracks in Verdun, facing a total collapse of the American lines to the north, he told the Supreme Allied Commander that he could take an army of 100,000 men, pivot them exactly 90 degrees on the spot, and drive straight into the flank of the German breakthrough, and that he could launch this attack in just 3 days. At that moment, the officers gathered around the map table fell dead silent. The maneuver Patton described seemed to defy the most basic mathematical logic of war. At the time, this massive army was facing east, pressing hard against the German border, with every artillery piece, every truck, and every frozen marching column pointing in the exact opposite direction. To make good on Patton's promise meant that this colossal marching formation had to be forcibly twisted sideways and driven north through the snow in the worst, most brutal winter Europe had seen in half a century, heading for a shattered little crossroads town called Bastogne. There, a heavily surrounded American division was in a desperate situation. Aside from their unyielding fighting spirit, they had absolutely nothing left. What those men gathered around the map table didn't know was that Patton wasn't taking a wild gamble at all. A full week before the first German artillery shell fell into the Ardennes forest, he had already quietly worked out the answer. This most daring tactical improvisation of the Second World War had, in fact, already been scripted in secret. The Ardennes is a stretch of dense forest and rolling hills along the border of Belgium and Luxembourg. By mid-December of 1944, the soldiers stationed there had given it a chilling nickname, the Ghost Front. For over 2 months, across this roughly 85-mile-wide stretch of woods, the two armies stared at each other within rifle range. Yet they lived in near total peace. The artillery would occasionally roar, but only to calibrate coordinates for some future battle that no one actually thought would ever come. The patrols, sent out at night, were less about drawing blood in combat and more about just keeping the men in shape. German and American soldiers sat in the freezing cold, the thick fog, and the dripping pine forests, so close they could hear each other moving. There was an unspoken understanding, and neither side could be bothered to break the quiet. It was the perfect place to hide a disaster. The senior Allied commanders had deliberately hollowed out this defensive sector, holding it with nothing but exhausted divisions and totally inexperienced new recruits. Every single assumption they made pointed to one thing: an attack here was absolutely impossible. The terrain here simply wasn't fit for tanks. The roads were not only few and far between, but they were also incredibly narrow. This forest seemed to naturally reject the kind of sweeping, massive armored assaults that had set the tone for the war on the Western Front. In the minds of those who really should have known better, the Ardennes became a safe place. Just those two words would end up costing them a heavy and bitter price. Behind the German lines, under the cover of this very same forest and the lengthening winter nights, the dictator ruling Germany was plotting the final, shocking, high-stakes gamble of the war. He gave the operation a name that carried a deliberate hint of irony: Operation Watch on the Rhine. He chose this name to make people think it was just a defensive posture, a tired army gritting its teeth to guard its own borders. The reality was anything but. This was a full-scale offensive aimed at slicing right through the middle of the British and American armies. They planned to smash across the Meuse River at full speed, retake the vital Belgian port of Antwerp, and completely shatter the unity of the Allies, thereby forcing the Western powers to sit down and make a separate peace. For this lethal blow, 3 massive armies had been assembled in total secrecy. 2 of them, built around a core of armored troops, were led by ruthless and highly experienced generals. The third was made up of riflemen tasked with firmly pinning down the southern shoulder of the breakthrough. Standing above them all was one of Germany's most brilliant field marshals, a man famous for cleaning up messes and patching holes. But this time, the mission he was handed was to tear the Allied defensive lines to shreds. The secrecy was taken to the absolute extreme. Under an almost paranoid set of ironclad rules, an army of over 200,000 men, nearly 2,000 artillery pieces, and roughly 1,000 tanks and assault guns slipped silently into their attack positions. Straw was spread across the roads to muffle the clanking and grinding of the tank tracks. Every single movement was carried out at night. The radios went dead silent. And in one of the most bizarre preparations of the entire war, a hand-picked group of English-speaking German soldiers put on captured American uniforms and climbed into American vehicles. They were sent to the front to infiltrate behind Allied lines, to seize bridges, switch around road signs, and spread fake orders, deliberately trying to create the kind of utter chaos that could turn a retreat into a full-blown rout. When the raging storm finally hit at dawn on January 16th, it slammed squarely into the one single place the Allies had decided they didn't need to worry about. When it comes to that early morning, we often hear a very comforting explanation, but it's an explanation that really needs to be questioned. The usual conclusion is that the Allied intelligence departments simply failed at their jobs, and that the Germans were able to pull off a complete surprise because nobody saw the warning signs. But that isn't entirely true, and the difference between the two is absolutely crucial. The signs, in fact, had been there the whole time. The aerial reconnaissance reports, the interrogations of prisoners of war, the heavy railway traffic, and the quiet building pressure right across from the weakly defended lines. The deeper failure wasn't a matter of being blind, but a matter of blind faith. The entire command structure had already made up its mind in advance. This front was dead and buried, and nothing else could possibly happen here. And once something gets filed away as safe, the human brain becomes incredibly good at selectively ignoring any evidence that proves it really isn't. The collapse of the Ghost Front wasn't caused by a lack of intelligence at all, but by a prejudice so deeply rooted that fresh facts simply couldn't shake it even a little bit. Right as the other Allied commanders were sleeping soundly in the comfort of this prejudice, one office inside the Third Army refused to play along. This office belonged to a colonel named Oscar Koch, who was Patton's chief of intelligence. He was a meticulous, highly legendary figure, and his job wasn't to read the enemy the way people wanted him to, but to tear the enemy apart based on hard, proven facts. In the first few weeks of December, as the Third Army was pushing east toward the German border and the fortifications of the Siegfried Line, Koch kept his eyes fixed on something taking shape to the north that made him incredibly uneasy. Right across from the First Army, in that sector everyone agreed was perfectly quiet. All sorts of signs were piling up. German units that should have been totally wiped out were being pulled off the line to regroup. Railway traffic was surging. Armored forces were gathering, and in a defensive battle, there was absolutely no reason to gather armored forces there. To Koch, this picture definitely wasn't just a tired enemy licking its wounds. This was clearly a fist slowly pulling back, getting ready to strike. On December 9th, he wrote all of this down very clearly in a report and sent it straight up the chain of command to the Supreme Allied Command, stating that the enemy still has the capability, even more worryingly, the intention to launch a massive, devastating counterattack, and the Ardennes is the most likely location. 2 days later, he sent out another warning, this time with even sharper wording, pointing directly at the forces gathering opposite the First Army. These weren't just vague, wishy-washy complaints about some potential danger. They were specific, they had dates, and they zeroed in perfectly on the exact spot where the storm would eventually break, and they were delivered a full week before the storm actually hit. However, these warnings were largely pushed aside. The higher-ups had already made up their minds, and a mind that's already set is pretty hard to shake with just a memo. Right at this moment, the character of Patton steps onto the stage, and the way he enters makes his later legendary image a bit complicated. In the popular myths, he's a general with some sort of animal instinct on the battlefield, a guy who could feel the enemy's intentions right in his bones. That picture is highly flattering, but it's completely wrong. What Patton actually had was far rarer than so-called instinct, and a lot less romantic too. He had the discipline to listen to an intelligence officer's incredibly badly timed conclusions, and he also had the guts to take decisive action when his own bosses were choosing to just sit tight. When Koch briefed him on the threat gathering to the north, Patton didn't just brush it off as somebody else's problem on somebody else's front line. He did the exact opposite. On December 12th, 3 days before the first German shell fell in the Ardennes forest, he gathered his staff and ordered them to study a question that bordered on heresy. If the First Army to the north actually gets broken through by the enemy, and the Third Army is ordered to pivot and hit this breakthrough from the south, exactly how would we do it? This order was the turning point that allowed the whole situation to be reversed, and it's really worth stopping to think about, because it completely bursts the bubble that history later worshipped as a miracle. A week later, when Patton stood in the Ardennes and made that impossible promise, he wasn't just winging it under pressure, and he wasn't just pulling a number out of thin air to shock everyone in a desperate room. He was simply repeating the conclusions of a staff study he had already ordered them to finish. While the front line to the north was still pretending to be asleep, exactly how a massive army would pivot, what routes they would take, how road priorities would be handed out, how corps-level formations would shift from one axis to another, along with a rough timetable for all of it, had already been put down on paper in cold, hard ink. His most incredibly daring decision of the war had actually already been quietly made behind closed doors by a man who simply did his homework. Looking back, we always love to credit great historical moments to the genius of great men, as if history always bows to the will of individual heroes who see things that nobody else can see. Telling history that way is really thrilling, but it's also deeply misleading. That December, in that freezing barracks, the cold, hard truth was a lot more sobering, but also a lot more useful. Patton's foresight wasn't some flash of prophetic brilliance. It was the perfectly ordinary result of a colonel who took the evidence seriously, and a commander who took that colonel seriously, working together. The warning letters were written for everyone. The difference wasn't about who got them, but about who chose to believe them and start getting ready. When disaster struck, the people who had decided in advance that nothing was going to happen got hit right in the face, and the man who had quietly rehearsed for the worst-case scenario was already a full 3 days ahead of the question that nobody else even dared to ask. By December 18th, the situation to the north had gone from worrying to genuinely hanging by a thread. German armored units had ripped a massive hole in the American lines, and this breach was getting wider by the hour, eventually spreading into that enormous salient that cemented this battle in the history books. Entire units were scattered and surrounded. The rumors were running faster than the facts, and the fake orders and switched road signs left behind by those English-speaking German infiltrators filled the rear areas with a low, gnawing, paranoid panic. It got so bad that sentries were even interrogating generals, and nobody's identity was going to pass, just on trust. In this atmosphere, the Supreme Commander called his top generals together on the 19th for a meeting in Verdun, getting straight to the point to figure out how on earth they were going to stop the bleeding. The room where they gathered was a harsh setting for a decision of this weight. A rundown French barracks where the freezing chill cut right through every single wall, and the only source of heat was a tiny little stove that was completely useless. The officers standing around the map were already exhausted, and the mood was incredibly grim. Right from the start, the Supreme Commander deliberately stressed that they had to treat the current situation as an opportunity, not a disaster. The enemy had basically shoved his own head into a noose, and now was the time to pull the knot tight. Then, he turned to the only army capable of pulling that noose tight from the bottom, looked at the general commanding it, and threw out the core question. How soon can the Third Army stop its eastward attack, turn around, and hit the southern flank of the breakthrough? Patton's answer has been repeated by later generations so many times that it has almost lost its edge, making it very easy to forget just how utterly shocking it sounded in that room at the time. He said he could attack with 3 divisions in 3 days. When he said this, his tone was almost casual, like a man stating a simple fact, not someone taking a gamble. The reaction in the room was close to pure disbelief. As far as the officers sitting there were concerned, this claim crashed head-on into everything they knew as common sense about moving large bodies of troops. A massive army is not a single person. You can't just tell it to turn around and expect it to turn. It's a huge, bloated organism that involves fuel, ammunition, and traffic control, covering tens of thousands of vehicles and 100,000 men. To make this giant beast not only pivot 90 degrees, break away from one enemy, and move to fight another in the dead of winter on icy roads within 72 hours, but also get into position and throw itself into combat right away. Everyone in the room felt it was an empty promise that no commander could ever keep. And what really gave that moment its profound sharpness was exactly what Patton didn't say. He let the people in the room sit there in shock, and he never popped their bubble of disbelief. He didn't explain that the staff study had already been written, that the routes and timetables had been worked out a week ago, and that before he even showed up to the meeting, he had already called his headquarters and started the whole machine moving with just a few code words, even while they were all still talking in this meeting. He allowed his confidence to look like he was bragging, because bragging was exactly what the people in that room expected from him, and also because a commander who is fully prepared simply doesn't need to care when other people mistake his brilliant foresight for a moment of reckless bravery. This seemingly reckless promise was, in fact, the most deeply thought-out thing spoken at that table that entire day. It has to be said that this absolute certainty Patton brought into that barracks didn't just belong to him alone. It had soaked all the way down through the ranks to the very bottom, creating a phenomenon that you just can't make up and you certainly can't fake. During those days, a tiny little conversation took place, recorded by a commander who was trapped in an equally brutal defensive fight in the town of St. Vith, and it captures the feeling better than any staff report ever could. Word had reached the front-line positions that Patton's Third Army had turned north and was driving hard straight for the underbelly of the salient. A colonel passed this news along to a sergeant who was holding the line at a freezing outpost in the snow. This was a man who had a million reasons to give up hope. He was out of ammo, out of food, and completely surrounded by the enemy. The sergeant chewed on this news for a moment and gave his entire assessment of the whole strategic situation in just one sentence. "Well, if George is coming, then we've got this in the bag." The colonel who wrote that down later said that, in all of Europe, he didn't know of any other senior general whose name alone getting closer could make an ordinary private respond like that in such a desperate spot. And that is the Ardennes, the real foundation that promise was built on. It definitely wasn't just the almost unbelievable math of 3 divisions in 3 days on a piece of paper. It was the faith built up in the most brutal classrooms by the men who had followed this army all the way across France and smashed into the Saar defensive lines. The faith that if this army said it was going to be there, it was absolutely going to be there. The Supreme Commander accepted the proposal. The people in the room then scattered, each diving headfirst into sorting out the details. And up north, in the blowing snow and the fast-approaching twilight, 100,000 men were being told to pull off the magnificent pivot that their commander had already rehearsed in secret. Once the order is given, you have to march, and marching was the real enemy this promise had to face. In these first few days, the enemy wasn't the German army at all. It was the sheer physical exhaustion of moving a force the size of a small city, and the weather this December had already turned into the most brutal winter Europe had seen in half a century. To understand just how incredibly hard this was, you have to close the map with all those clean, neat arrows drawn on it later, and look at the real situation on the ground. Tens of thousands of vehicles were originally facing east toward the Saar, and their crews were all gearing up for a completely different fight. Fuel dumps, field hospitals, communication lines, ammo reserves, this entire massive system that kept an army breathing had originally been spread out to support a drive in a totally different direction. Now, all of that had to be completely unstitched rethreaded facing north, and managed perfectly to make sure this shift didn't paralyze the whole route into a massive traffic jam stretching halfway across the continent. This is the hidden discipline behind the dramatic scenes, and it's also the part the legendary stories usually leave out. Before it becomes an art of bravery, pivoting a massive army is, first and foremost, a science of logistics. The roads had to be handed out hour by hour to specific columns, just so an armored division and a rifle division wouldn't crash into each other at the exact same crossroads in the exact same early morning hours and choke their own guys to death right on the road. Military police had to be nailed down at every single intersection, just to keep the endless rivers of traffic flowing in the pitch-black night. Fuel had to be prepositioned along the axis of the new front line, so the tanks wouldn't just die a dozen miles from their target. Because a tank with an empty fuel tank isn't a weapon at all. It's nothing more than a freezing iron box sitting out in an open field. Patton's own understanding of this was clear, to the point of being almost paranoid. And it was exactly the earlier research done by his staff that allowed this giant beast to move fast enough to look like pure magic to anyone watching from the outside. The choreography had already been written. Now, they just had to dance it out on the ice, in the dark, with a ticking clock pushing them forward. The freezing chill was everywhere. The bitter winter of 1944 to 1945 fell on the Ardennes forest with a kind of viciousness that survivors still can't find the words to describe today. Engines froze so hard they just wouldn't start, and you had to coax them warm like you were babying an infant. Metal froze completely solid. Soldiers rode in open-top trucks or lay flat on the decks of tanks in the bone-chilling night wind, and by the time they reached the staging areas, more than half their bodies were totally numb. Their rations were frozen into blocks of ice, and their weapons were stiff with the cold. Frostbite stepped in and played the role of the enemy, stripping soldiers right off the line one by one before they even touched a piece of shrapnel. The roads turned into smooth ribbons of ice like mirrors, then churned into seas of brown mud where the traffic ground them up, and then, as the temperature plummeted again, they froze right back into solid ice. Before they even locked horns with a single German soldier, every single mile clawed away from this physical world was a bitter, costly victory. This weather wasn't just some passive force making everybody miserable. In the most literal sense of the word, it was a weapon, and it was working for the enemy. The same suffocatingly low clouds and thick, sticky, dripping fog didn't just turn the roads into pure torture. They also kept the Allied air power pinned dead to the ground. The fighter-bombers that had spent the entire autumn tearing German columns to shreds from the sky, making it impossible for any tank caught out in the open to move an inch during the day, were now just sitting uselessly on the airfields, blinded by a sky the color of a wet slate. The German commander running the Western Front would later admit this advantage in a very dry, professional tone. After the war, he said the weather was a weapon his army used very successfully in the Battle of the Ardennes. The timing of this attack was aimed squarely at the weather forecast. The storm that grounded the planes was, just like the tanks themselves, an absolutely vital piece of the German plan from the start. Reading about historical moments like this, it's really easy to get carried away, stacking up heroic words, and to imagine that this pivot to the north was pulled off by sheer willpower, forced through by the trademark aggression of the famous general at the top. The truth is actually far more ordinary, and because of that, it's even more moving. In those days, what got the army around that corner definitely wasn't just arrogant bragging. It was fuel delivered exactly to the right spot. It was a half-frozen military policeman at 3 o'clock in the morning, waving his arms in a blacked-out village to wave a column through. It was a march table drawn up a week earlier by staff officers whose names never made it onto any monuments. That great maneuver, which history worships as Patton's glorious, all-or-nothing gamble, was actually down at the grassroots level where it really happened. A triumph of laying down pipelines, timing the clock perfectly, and cold, hard administrative efficiency, all pulled off in a brutal environment where even the tiniest mistake would be brutally punished. It's really worth stopping to chew on just how incredibly slim the margin for error was here, because it reveals exactly how the earth-shattering events of a war actually turn. The lives of 100,000 men and the fate of the surrounded division they were racing to save didn't depend on some grand strategy at all. It depended on whether a specific column could find gasoline at a specific crossroads on a specific freezing cold night. If you just flipped a few little outcomes in the middle of all this, if the fuel was sent down the wrong road, or if traffic got tied up in a dead knot, or if the ice and snow took out one crucial bridge, the timetable would have slipped, the reinforcements would have been a day late, and the story we write about that December would have a completely different ending. The winners and losers of massive wars are often decided by these totally unromantic, trivial little details, a lot more often than we actually like to admit. The generals in the Ardennes argued about divisions, flanks, and grand ambitions. But the actual pivoting of this massive army was chewed out mile after mile in the freezing ice and snow, and it relied entirely on the parts of war that don't earn medals and don't make it into the history books, but without which the most heroic promise ever made in a freezing French barracks would have just faded away into empty words. During those days, there is also a little anecdote that has become something of a legend that needs to be mentioned. And like most legends, it deserves to be restored to what it really looked like, because the true version is much weirder and far more revealing than the whitewashed ones. A few days before the storm hit, back at the headquarters of the Third Army in the French city of Nancy, Patton called his chaplain and his deputy chief of staff into his office and issued an order that had absolutely nothing to do with tanks or terrain. He said he was truly sick and tired of his soldiers having to fight the mud and the floods at the exact same time they were fighting the Germans for their lives. He wanted the chaplain to write and publish a prayer asking for good weather, to use his own words, something that could persuade God to stand on their side for once, just for a change of pace. This chaplain, a man named O'Neill, was a deeply thoughtful man, and for a moment he was caught right between his duty and his conscience. Because his deputy chief of staff later wrote this conversation down, this piece of history was able to be passed on. Choosing his words very carefully, the chaplain reminded him that pulling off a prayer of that magnitude would probably require a pretty thick blanket. Patton wasn't moved in the slightest. He said he didn't care if it took a blanket or a flying carpet. He just wanted this prayer getting done. The chaplain tried one more time, gathering his courage to say that in their line of work, praying for clear skies just so they could be more efficient at killing their fellow men really wasn't how things were done. Patton's answer put a full stop straight onto this conversation, completely sketching out his entire mindset in one stroke. He asked the chaplain, "Are you sitting here preaching theology to me? Or are you the chaplain of the Third Army?" He just wanted a prayer. And so, the prayer was written, printed onto thousands of little cards by the Army's own mapping company, with the general's Christmas greeting to his men printed right on the back, and handed out to the entire Army. The message begged the Almighty to hold back the endless, unrestrained rain and grant a clear day fit for battle, so that the soldiers, armed with divine power, could march out of the mud and straight into victory. Now it's time for the part that the legendary stories quietly erased, and it needs to be put back where it belongs, because popular memory has squeezed the facts into a much neater shape than what they really were. Today, people almost without exception remember this prayer as the Bastogne prayer, believing it was a desperate plea sent up to heaven to part the clouds so the trapped defenders could be saved and the bombers could finally take to the sky. But that wasn't how it happened at all. When the order to write this prayer was given, the German offensive hadn't even started yet, and this prayer was meant for a completely different purpose. To bring clear skies for an attack, the Third Army was scheduled to launch toward the Rhine River in late December, an operation that was completely washed away by the Ardennes crisis before it even happened. By pure coincidence, these cards were handed out to the soldiers on December 22nd, and by that time, the massive army had already pivoted and headed north, and the original reason mentioned in the prayer was already completely gone. History simply found it convenient to reassign it to a new home. A plea written for one battle was slapped onto the head of another, simply because the story of the second battle sounded a whole lot better. The way things unfolded took a dramatic turn. The skies actually did clear up. On the 23rd, which was the very next day after the cards went out, the leaden-gray canopy over the Ardennes forest broke open, and the bright, clear weather held perfectly for the better part of a week. That was enough time for the fighter-bombers to return to the blue skies, completely wiping out the German columns that had been marching recklessly under the protection of the clouds just before. Patton was absolutely overjoyed, and his reaction was exactly as colorful as you would expect. He sent someone to fetch the chaplain, announced that he was the most popular man in the entire headquarters, saying he had a great relationship with both God and the soldiers, and pinned a medal right onto his chest. The deputy chief of staff, who wrote all of this down, added the only truly honest comment: whether this was the hand of God guiding them or just the normal, natural turning of the weather, they would never really be able to tell. That inability to tell is exactly the most interesting part of this whole episode, and the part that is most worth keeping. On the grand stage of history, we often feel completely lost when we run into coincidences. When a prayer begging for clear skies is immediately followed by perfectly clear skies, and that clearing up helps decide the direction of the greatest battle of this war, the human brain almost can't help itself from trying to tie a string of cause and effect right between the two. Believing that heaven actually answered the call is a lot more satisfying than accepting that a high-pressure system just rolled in on its own cold, indifferent schedule and just happened to bump into a printed piece of cardboard. But the most honest stance is actually the stance taken by the chaplain's deputy, refusing to weave that kind of neat cause and effect, and just living peacefully with not knowing. The reason this story managed to survive isn't because anyone proved the prayer actually worked, but because we are just so desperate to live in a world where it might have worked. A world where the right words at the right moment can actually shake the universe. But the facts are incredibly stubborn, refusing to confirm it, while at the same time refusing to deny it either. The offensive kicked off in the cold, pitch-black night of December 22nd, with 3 corps pushing forward shoulder to shoulder. The armored division sitting right in the center carried the heaviest hopes because it was the fastest formation Patton had in his hands, and the unit most likely to get there before the trapped defenders completely ran out of luck. The soldiers handed the heavy burden of this assault were essentially just given a strict mandate for speed. They were hoping to copy the army's usual way of fighting, just like they had done on the battlefields of France over the summer. Smash open a hole, pour through like a tidal wave, turn speed itself into a weapon, and leave the tedious work of cleaning up the battlefield to the infantry following behind. However, they realized almost immediately that the Ardennes simply wasn't going to allow that. This was a brutal fight with completely different rules, and it knocked them right on their heels in the very first mile. This piece of land was just like the enemy. It was out to get them. The roads were few and narrow, surrounded by nothing but thick forest, which meant the armored columns couldn't spread out to coordinate their attacks at all. They had to inch forward in single file, crawling straight into the alleys the Germans had already guessed they would take. Every single village along the way was a puzzle that had to be solved one by one. The Germans had packed them with stubborn, perfectly positioned defenders, and they had to be dug out of those villages one by one before the advance could keep going. There was no unstoppable, sweeping breakthrough here, no clean and simple penetration. There was only the painfully slow work of ripping out strong points kilometer by kilometer, one by one, all while the weather punished you for every single hour you spent out in the open. A senior officer from that armored division put it in very plain English after the war. They could have fired up the tanks and charged straight into the trapped town at any time. But charging ahead wouldn't secure the road behind them, and an unsecured road was totally worthless. So they had no choice but to chew on the hardest bones, clearing the path as they went, and chewing on hard bones meant moving very slowly. The fight for one of those villages, a place called Chaumont, which was just a handful of kilometers from their target, perfectly showed just how brutally their timetable was going to be tortured. The armored column slammed right into this place and was brought to a dead stop. The Germans brought in their own heavy armor, including some of the most lethal self-propelled artillery pieces they had in their inventory. The front armor on these war machines simply didn't care about the shells the American tanks were throwing at them, and the American advance was pinned to the ground right outside the village under their crushing firepower. A counterattack drove the Americans right back out again. This place had to be taken the old-fashioned way, bringing the infantry up to do the close quarters, hand-to-hand fighting that the armor guys just couldn't handle on their own. It wasn't until reinforcements finally arrived on the 26th that the village was completely taken back. In just this single little fight, one young soldier earned the nation's highest award, the Medal of Honor. A few other men would also earn that honor along this frozen road, serving as a reminder that behind every seemingly tiny push of the front line on the situation maps, there was an afternoon where the soldiers on the ground barely made it out alive. The casualties piled up in ways that the maps never managed to show. This armored division definitely didn't jump into this fight fresh and full of life. Before pivoting north, it had already been fighting tooth and nail in the Saar sector for weeks, and it carried that utter exhaustion into the Ardennes forest, exactly like carrying an open wound. A tank company that was supposed to have 17 vehicles at full strength went into the fight with 10, and a company that still had 10 tanks left was actually considered incredibly lucky. The number of riflemen in the armored infantry battalions had already dropped down to half or barely over half of their normal strength, and these were the exact men most urgently needed for the clearing work this terrain demanded. The tank crews were short on men, and there were absolutely no replacements coming in to fill the gaps, which meant the exact same exhausted guys had to do more work, stand more guard shifts, and spend more time out in the freezing night doing maintenance on their vehicles, burning themselves out even further. Later on, they shoved a batch of about 70 replacements into this battered unit, guys pulled straight from anti-aircraft and rear echelon outfits. These men hadn't received any formal infantry training at all and were sent straight to the absolute front line because the desperate situation simply didn't leave any time for them to get used to it. By the time the division reached its target, every single one of those 70 men had gone down, either killed, wounded, or completely shattered mentally by a brutal encounter they were never prepared to face. This was one of the most deeply hidden tragedies of the entire advance, and one of the most telling ones too. If we're willing to be completely honest when we look back at this battle, we'll find that popular memory's version of this relief effort really doesn't do justice to the soldiers who actually pulled it off. We remember it as a charge, a beautiful cavalry sprint, a massive army galloping to the rescue under the command of their famous general. The truth couldn't be further from that. It was a crawl, a brutal inch-by-inch slugfest against an enemy who fought like hell for every single village, squeezed every possible delay out of carefully chosen positions, and launched counterattacks every single time they got the chance. And all of this was done by an exhausted, undermanned army suffering through the bitter cold of winter. The drama is absolutely real, but it lives in the pile-up of all that trivial, exhausting, entirely unphotogenic suffering, not in any one single breathtaking moment. The distance from the starting line to the trapped town really wasn't very far, just a dozen miles or so in a straight line. To cover that ground, it took 4 solid days of that kind of misery. Every single kilometer here was paid for in blood. This piece of history got compressed into a victorious headline, but on the ground, it was a brutal ordeal that almost didn't make it in time. By the afternoon of December 26th, the lead units of the armored division had chewed their way right to the edge of their target. They were so close they could feel the trapped town sitting just behind the next line of trees, but at the same time, they knew this final stretch might be the most dangerous part of the whole trip. The final approach corridor had to pass through 2 little villages, Cloquimont and then Assenois. Past Assenois, the road climbed along a ridge and into a thick stretch of woods. This was exactly the kind of terrain where a few defenders with anti-tank guns and a willingness to die could turn a road into a complete graveyard. The commander on the ground was staring down a choice that every soldier could feel right in the pit of their stomach. He could stop, lock down his position and wait, gathering his forces to launch a systematic, carefully planned assault. Doing it that way might cost less blood, but it would absolutely burn time, and time was the one thing the trapped defenders completely ran out of. Or he could shove all his chips onto speed, gambling that a wild, hurricane-like sprint could smash right through this last line of defense before the enemy even had time to set themselves up to stop it. The man leading the charge was the commander of the tank battalion sitting at the absolute front of the line. His name would later become famous far beyond this road, even though on that afternoon he was just a lieutenant colonel with a cold cigar clamped tightly in the corner of his mouth, staring down a tough choice. He made his choice. He told his men he was taking the column in right now, and with a wave of his arm, the column roared forward. The plan, if you could even call it a plan, was simple to the extreme. A few tanks were going to smash straight down the road, tear right through Assenwa, and plunge into the woods behind it, with every single gun blazing, completely banking on momentum and shock power to crack the hole open before the Germans even knew what hit them. Behind them, 4 artillery battalions were going to absolutely pound the village and the tree line, pulling up a wall of explosive barrage right in front of the advancing armor. This barrage had to be close enough to keep the defenders' heads pinned to the dirt, but not so close that it blew up the very people they were trying to save. Sitting inside the lead tank was a second lieutenant named Bogus. The story he told after the war lets you feel the texture of those few minutes better than any official report ever could. He remembered that those villages were packed with defenders, and after that, the road climbed up into a thick forest, crawling with the enemy. They were going through at top speed, every gun spitting fire, charging straight down that road, trying to bust through before the defenders could even get set up. When the tank started moving, he thought about all the things that could end it all in the blink of an eye. Were there mines buried in the road? Had the bridge ahead been blown up? Was there an anti-tank gunner already dialed in on the exact spot he was about to pop out of? And then the charge kicked off, and there was no more time for his mind to wander. The artillery rained down on Assenwa like a storm of shells. The ground shook, houses collapsed right into the middle of the street, and the tanks didn't slow down, tearing straight through the heavy smoke and the crumbling bricks. The gunner inside Bogus's tank used the main gun like it was a machine gun, firing over and over again at any corner that might be hiding a weapon, ripping off more than 20 rounds in just a few short minutes, while the loader shoved shells in non-stop like a madman. An enemy anti-tank gun sitting on a half-track opened up, but it missed, kicking up a fountain of dirt right on the road that smeared the driver's vision. The gunner caught it in his sights and blew it straight to Kingdom Come. The driver, half-blind, felt his way down the road, his brakes locking up at one point. He took a wrong turn, backed up, and kept driving forward. The lead tanks completely left the slower half-tracks behind as they fell back inside the artillery-shredded village. This tiny little spearhead burst out of the woods all by itself, sweeping the ridge with firepower as it went. And then, incredibly suddenly, there was no more resistance up ahead, just a wide-open patch of white snow. And out on this white snow, Bogus saw something they had already earned. Parachutes, red ones, yellow ones, blue ones, scattered all over the vast white fields like pieces of confetti. Those were the supply parachutes the trapped defenders had gathered up during the days they were surrounded. He geared the roaring tank down to a crawl. Up ahead were foxholes, and heads wearing steel helmets peeking out over the sights of carbine rifles. These guys hadn't heard a single piece of news before this, and didn't dare to trust anyone, so they were just staring at this one single tank that had popped out of the smoke all by itself. Bogus stood up in the turret and yelled at them, "Come on out! We're with the 4th Armored Division!" For a really long time, nobody answered back, just those cautious steel helmets and leveled gun barrels. He yelled it one more time. Finally, a figure stood up and started walking toward the tank. It was an engineer officer from the trapped division. He walked right up to the lieutenant and delivered the simplest greeting you can find in the English language. "Glad to see you." The time at that exact moment was 4:45 in the afternoon on December 26th. The steel ring surrounding the little town had been smashed open. This is the core image of the entire battle that the world remembers, and it fully deserves that spot, but it needs to be seen for what it actually was, not the version spun by the legendary stories. This definitely wasn't some overwhelming, massive army rolling in for a triumphant victory. It was just a few battered and bruised tanks, short on men and running on fumes after 4 days of grinding misery, gambling everything on a wild charge up one single road. And they just happened to pull it off. The corridor they cracked open was really just a thin line at first, an incredibly fragile little path that would take several more days of bitter, exhausting fighting just to widen and lock down. The guys in those foxholes watching Bogus walk up had already been holding the line to the death for a solid week, absorbing everything the enemy threw at them, and when the reinforcements finally showed up, it wasn't some unstoppable tidal wave, but just one cold, lonely tank crawling out of the woods. The absolute majesty of that moment wasn't in its scale. The scale was actually pretty small, but in one simple, massive fact. Staring down the math that everyone at the Ardennes meeting thought was totally impossible, this army actually managed to pivot, managed to push through, and managed to get there. The promise made in a freezing barracks exactly 1 week ago had been kept by the absolute slimmest, most terrifying margin. Smashing open the ring of encirclement wasn't the end of the fight at all. It was just the turning of the tide. That narrow corridor, cracked open at Astonishing, had to be widened and defended to the death against the frantic, desperate counterattacks of a German command that knew exactly what losing it meant. The few days right after the link-up were just as brutal as any day before them, and the larger struggle dragged right on into the new year. But the decisive turning point had already happened. The trapped defenders were no longer fighting all alone. The southern flank of that massive Bulge had been smashed right in, and the strategic initiative the Germans had grabbed in the thick fog on December 16th was gone. They began a slow, incredibly costly retreat back to the other side. Throughout the entire month of January, the enemy was forced into a bleeding retreat back toward the fixed bunkers of the Siegfried Line. When the pincer attack from the two massive American armies finally clamped shut near the town of Houffalize, the Bulge that had nearly ripped the Allied lines to pieces was completely stomped flat. The German dictator's final, earth-shattering gamble on the Western Front ended in total failure, and the men who spun a massive army 90 degrees in the middle of a blizzard deserved the lion's share of the credit. The stories that spread around all of this quickly hardened into a shape that the general public knows today. The relief of the trapped town became the ultimate, shining example of one general's brilliant mind and bold courage. It became the one glowing moment in his career that even his harshest, most picky critics couldn't tear down, his absolute crowning achievement. That assessment makes a lot of sense, and if you just stripped it all away completely, it would be far too mean-spirited. The promise in the Ardennes was real. The pivot was real, arriving in the absolute nick of time was real, and that unshakable certainty flowing straight down from the commander all the way to a freezing sergeant on the front line was also real and incredibly precious. The deepest, most profound lesson of that December actually got left behind on the other side of the legend, left in the part that is really hard to carve onto a stone monument. In the end, what actually saved the day definitely wasn't some flash of battlefield genius that just appeared out of thin air the second the crisis hit. It was preparation. The quiet, behind-the-scenes preparation done days earlier by a commander who chose to believe a very badly timed warning when all of his bosses were choosing not to. Long before the pivoting of this massive army stunned everyone in the Ardennes, the routes had already been studied, and the rough drafts had already been sketched out. When you look at it closely, this miracle just fades away, turning into something that has absolutely no magic to it at all, but is far more revealing. This was the payoff handed to a man who simply did his homework, while everyone else had already decided the front line was perfectly safe. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson you should take away from that frozen, deadly road to Bastogne. The most daring, gutsy strike of this entire war wasn't won in the split second he made up his mind, but a week earlier, when one single general stood alone and refused to blindly swallow what everyone wanted to hear, and won it in those thoroughly unromantic hours, just doing his homework.